There are losses that hollow you out from the inside. When Harold Fiske lost both his children in a car accident, the world went silent. At 63, he wanted to disappear. So he bought 5 acres of forgotten swampland for $5. It was nothing, just water, weeds, and silence. He went there to be alone with his grief. But on his first morning, 2 wild horses walked out of the marsh and stood at the water's edge. They came back the next day, and the day after that. Something about them kept Harold from sinking completely. Then he met Mara, a wildlife biologist who'd been observing these horses for years. What she told him changed everything. Could a $5 piece of land give a grieving father a reason to live again? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Harold Fiske had lived in the same house for 32 years. Every corner held a memory. Every photograph on the wall was a reminder of what he'd lost. 6 months after the accident, he still couldn't bring himself to enter Emily's old bedroom or sort through Grant's belongings in the garage. The silence in those spaces was too heavy, too final. He'd retired from teaching high school history 3 years earlier, looking forward to travel and time with his grown children. Emily had been 31, a veterinary assistant with dreams of opening her own practice. Grant, 28, worked as a civil engineer in the city, designing bridges that would outlast them all. They'd been close, despite the 4-year age gap. Every Sunday they'd come for dinner, filling the house with laughter and stories. Then came that January night, a drunk driver, an icy road. 2 lives ended in an instant. Harold had identified their bodies at the morgue. He'd sat through the funeral in a fog. He'd accepted casseroles from neighbors whose names he couldn't remember. His ex-wife, Diane, had flown in from California, and they'd stood together at the graveside, united in grief, if nothing else. Their marriage had ended 12 years ago. Not dramatically, just a slow erosion of connection. But burying your children changes the mathematics of every past relationship. The days blurred together after that. Harold stopped answering the phone. He let the lawn grow wild. He sat in his living room chair and stared at the walls until the light changed, and it was time to sleep again. Then, one sleepless night in late March, he found himself scrolling through his laptop, clicking aimlessly through pages. A county auction site appeared. Surplus properties, tax defaults, abandoned lots. Most were worthless parcels, the kind no one wanted. That's when he saw it. 5 acres of wetland, classified as unusable. Starting bid, $5. The photograph showed dark water, dense reeds, tangled vegetation, no structures, no road access marked, just a coordinate on a map outside, Merrick's Bend, a town he'd never heard of, 3 hours north. Harold bid $5 at 2 in the morning. No one else bid. By dawn, he owned it. He didn't tell anyone. He loaded his truck with a small camping trailer he'd bought years ago for a trip that never happened, packed a few clothes, and left his house with the doors locked and the lights on timers. He left a note for his neighbor to collect the mail. He didn't say where he was going or when he'd return. The drive north felt like moving through water. The landscape changed gradually, suburbs giving way to farmland, farmland to forest, forest to something wilder. Merrick's Bend appeared suddenly, a cluster of buildings along a slow river, population 3,200 according to the faded sign. He drove through without stopping, following the coordinates on his phone down increasingly rough roads. The final mile was barely a road at all. 2 ruts through tall grass, branches scraping the sides of his truck. Then the land opened before him. A pond, maybe 2 acres across, dark as coffee. reeds thick as a man's wrist crowding the edges, trees draped with moss, and silence so complete it pressed against his eardrums. Harold parked near a stand of old oaks and sat in the truck for an hour, engine off, windows down. A heron landed at the water's edge, folded itself into stillness, and waited. Harold understood that patience. He was waiting too, though for what, he couldn't say. He set up the camper that first day, a simple pull-behind that gave him a bed, a small stove, and a table. The ground was soft but level enough near the tree line. He worked slowly, methodically, focusing on each task to keep his mind from wandering into dangerous territory. That night, he sat outside on a folding chair and watched darkness gather. The sounds of the swamp emerged gradually. Frogs in layered chorus, the splash of fish or turtle, the rustle of wind through reed beds. No human sounds, no traffic, no voices, no television from a neighbor's window. Just the living world, doing what it had always done. He thought about Emily and Grant. He thought about how Grant used to catch frogs as a boy, how Emily would insist on releasing them gently back into the pond. He thought about Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings and graduations and all the ordinary moments he'd taken for granted. The grief rose up like water, and he let it. There was no one here to see him cry. The first week passed in a haze. Harold established small routines. Coffee at dawn, a walk around the property's vague boundaries, simple meals heated on the camp stove. He found remnants of old fencing, rotted posts marking some long-abandoned attempt at order. He discovered rusted tools half buried in mud. The land had a history, he could sense that, but it had been forgotten for a long time. On his 8th morning, he woke before dawn and walked to the pond's edge. Mist hung low over the water, thick as cotton. The world was grey and quiet. He stood there, coffee cup in hand, and watched the light change. That's when they appeared. 2 horses emerged from the mist, like ghosts made solid. A bay mare, her coat dark and sleek, and a younger grey stallion, lighter in colour, moving with a slight hesitation in his gait. They stopped at the water's edge, perhaps 30 yards from where Harold stood frozen. The mare dipped her head to drink. The stallion watched Harold with dark, intelligent eyes. Neither showed fear exactly, but there was caution in their stillness. They were wild. That much was clear from their wariness, the way they held themselves ready to flee. But something about this place, this water, drew them here despite the presence of a human. Harold didn't move. He barely breathed. The moment stretched, fragile as spider silk. Then, as quietly as they'd come, the horses turned and walked back into the reeds, disappearing into the mist. Harold stood there long after they'd gone, his coffee grown cold in his hands. Something in his chest had shifted, just slightly. A small crack in the numbness that had encased him for months. The horses returned the next morning, and the morning after that. Always at dawn, always cautious. But each day they came a little closer, stayed a little longer. Harold began to wait for them, to time his own routine around their arrival. He found himself talking to them, softly as they drank, telling them things he couldn't tell another person. "I had 2 children," he said one morning, his voice rough from disuse. "They're gone now." The mare flicked an ear toward him, but kept drinking. The stallion watched him steadily. "I don't know what I'm doing here," Harold continued. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do next." The horses offered no answers, but they stayed, and somehow that was enough. 3 weeks into his stay, Harold decided to explore beyond the immediate area around his camp. The horses had established a pattern now, dawn visits, occasional returns in the evening. He'd begun to feel a kind of guardianship over them, though they were wild and needed nothing from him. He followed a faint trail that led deeper into the property, pushing through stands of cattails and skirting muddy patches. The land was larger than he'd realized, the boundaries unclear. Near what he guessed was the northern edge, he found the remains of an old fence line, posts leaning at drunken angles, wire long since rusted away. Something glinted in the mud near one of the posts. Harold crouched down, brushing away wet soil. A brass compass emerged, tarnished green but still intact. He cleaned it against his shirt, and the needle swung lazily before settling north. The craftsmanship was old. This had been made to last, to guide someone through unfamiliar territory. Harold held it in his palm, feeling its weight. For 30 years he'd taught history. He'd helped students navigate the past, find their bearings in the sweep of events. Now he was the one lost, holding a compass, in a swamp, unsure which direction to go. "That's private property you're standing on." Harold straightened quickly, turning toward the voice. A woman stood about 20 yards away, holding a camera with a long lens. She wore practical field clothes, canvas pants, a weathered jacket, boots caked with mud. Her hair was grey, cut short, and her face had the kind of lines that came from years of squinting into sunlight. "I own this land," Harold said, more defensively than he'd intended. "I know," the woman said, lowering the camera. "I saw your camper. I'm sorry for trespassing. I've been documenting the horses for 3 years, and I didn't know anyone had finally claimed the property." She stepped closer, extending a hand. "Mara Delane. I'm a wildlife biologist with the State Conservation Office." Harold shook her hand, noting the firm grip, the directness of her gaze. "Harold Fiske." "The horses trust you already," Mara said. "I've been watching from a distance. That's remarkable. They're usually more cautious with people." "They just show up," Harold said. "I don't do anything special. You're calm around them. Animals sense that." Mara gestured toward the water. "Do you mind if I continue my observations? I can stay on the periphery. I'm tracking their movements, their health, their social behavior. There used to be more of them. A full band. These two are all that's left in this area." Harold studied her. There was something straightforward about Mara that put him at ease. "What happened to the others?" "Scattered over the years. Development, habitat loss. Some were captured and relocated. These two have stayed together, though. The mare, I call her Pearl, though I know you shouldn't name wild animals. She's protective of the stallion. He has an old injury, probably from barbed wire. Walks with a limp. She won't leave him." They walked together back toward the pond, Mara pointing out signs Harold had missed, hoof prints in the mud, disturbed vegetation where the horses had grazed, droppings that indicated their diet. "This land is important to them," Mara said. "The water quality is good, and the vegetation provides cover. Without access to places like this, wild horses can't survive." They reached Harold's camp, and he surprised himself by offering coffee. Mara accepted, settling onto the log he'd positioned near his fire ring. As he heated water on the camp stove, she pulled up images on her camera's display screen. "These are from 2 years ago," she said, turning the screen toward him. "This is Pearl and Compass. That's what I call the stallion. And these others, this was their family group." Harold looked at the photographs. 5 horses moving together across a meadow, heads up, alert but not frightened. There was beauty in their wildness, their belonging to this landscape. "You knew this place before I bought it," Harold said. "I've been coming here for years. The property was in legal limbo. No one owned it, or everyone did, depending on how you looked at it. The county let it sit, because it was worthless for development." She paused, sipping her coffee. "Can I ask why you bought it?" Harold looked toward the pond. The question was simple, but the answer wasn't. "I needed to get away from everything." Mara nodded slowly, not pushing. They sat in silence for a while, and Harold found he didn't mind her presence. There was no pressure to perform grief or explain himself. "I worked with someone named Emily Fiske about 5 summers ago," Mara said quietly, "at Crosswinds Animal Rescue, over in Hadley County. She was volunteering while finishing her veterinary assistant certification." Harold's chest tightened. "That was my daughter. I thought the name might be connected. She talked about her father sometimes. Said you taught history, that you'd taught her to look for the stories behind the facts." Mara met his eyes. "I'm sorry. I saw the obituary last winter. Both your children. I can't imagine." "No," Harold said, his voice rough. "You can't." "I lost my husband 4 years ago," Mara said. "Cancer. It's not the same as losing a child, I know that. But I understand something about grief, how it changes the shape of everything." Harold nodded, unable to speak. Emily. Of course Emily would have worked with someone like Mara, someone who dedicated her life to animals, to preservation, to care. "She was gentle with every animal that came through," Mara continued, "even the difficult ones, the ones who'd been hurt badly. She never gave up on them. And she laughed. God, she had this wonderful laugh that made everyone around her feel lighter." Tears burned in Harold's eyes. He blinked them back, but Mara had already seen. "I shouldn't have brought it up," she said. "I'm sorry." "No," Harold managed. "No, it's good to hear that she was like that with other people too. That I'm not just remembering her through a father's bias." They sat together as the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist. Mara showed him more photographs, detailed shots of the horses over the years, their seasonal changes, their interactions. She talked about their resilience, how they'd adapted to shrinking habitat, how important places like this swamp were becoming. "I'd like to keep observing them, if you're willing," Mara said eventually. "I'll stay out of your way. I know you came here for solitude." Harold surprised himself again. "You're not in my way." Mara smiled, and it transformed her serious face into something warmer. "Your daughter would have liked what you're doing here, giving the horses a safe place." "I'm not doing anything," Harold said. "I just bought the land. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes just not destroying something is an act of preservation." As Mara prepared to leave, she paused. "There are rumors about this property, about the family who used to live here. If you're interested, we could check the county records, learn more about the history." Harold looked at the compass still in his pocket. "I'd like that. I'll come back in a few days," Mara said. "If that's all right." "It is," Harold said, and meant it. After she left, Harold walked back to the pond. The horses had returned, grazing peacefully near the reeds. He sat on the bank and watched them, the compass warm in his hand. For the first time since the accident, the future didn't seem quite so empty. Harold woke the next morning with a strange feeling in his chest. Not quite hope, but something close to purpose. He'd slept better than he had in months. The horses arrived at their usual time, and he greeted them from a respectful distance, noting how the mare, Pearl as Mara had called her, seemed more relaxed in his presence. After they left, Harold decided to do something he hadn't done since arriving. He started clearing the overgrown paths. The physical work felt good, necessary. He found a rusted machete in his truck's toolbox and began cutting back the brambles that choked what had once been a trail around the property's edge. The rhythm of the work was meditative, Cut, clear, step forward. His muscles protested at first. He'd let himself go soft in retirement. But soon the movements became automatic. Sweat dampened his shirt despite the cool morning air. He worked until noon, then ate a simple lunch, then worked again until his hands blistered. 3 days passed this way. Harold carved paths, repaired sections of old fence with materials he bought in town, and gradually began to see the land's potential structure. The horses watched his progress with apparent interest, sometimes following along the fence line as he worked. On the 4th day, Mara returned carrying a cardboard box and 2 cups of coffee from town. "I brought provisions," she announced, settling onto the camper's small step. "And I found something interesting at the county clerk's office." Harold wiped his hands on his jeans and joined her, accepting the coffee gratefully. His palms were raw despite the work gloves he'd started wearing. Mara opened the box to reveal yellow documents, photocopied pages, and a thick folder. "The property records go back to 1952. That's when Frank and Pearl Whitmore bought 40 acres here. Not 5, 40. They built a house, raised horses, had 2 children. Harold leaned forward, studying the old property survey map Mara spread across the camper's small table. "What happened to the other 35 acres? "That's where it gets complicated. In 1974, both Whitmore children drowned in the pond during a spring flood. They were young, 8 and 11. The parents were devastated, as you'd imagine. They abandoned the property within months." Harold felt the words like a physical blow. 2 children, lost to this place. The parallel was too stark, too familiar. "Pearl's brother subdivided the land after she and Frank left," Mara continued gently. "Sold it off in parcels. But there's evidence the subdivisions weren't entirely legal. Pearl died in 1998, and her estate was never properly settled. Your $5 purchase might actually have given you claim to more than you realize." "I don't want more land," Harold said quietly. "I just wanted—" He stopped, unsure how to finish. "To disappear," Mara said. "I know. But sometimes what we want and what we need are different things." They sat in silence, the weight of the Whitmore tragedy hanging between them. Finally, Mara spoke again. "Would you like to see if we can find where the house was?" Harold nodded, and they set out together across the property. Mara navigated by the old survey map, pointing them northwest toward higher ground. After 20 minutes of walking, they found it, the remains of a foundation, barely visible beneath decades of leaf litter and creeping vegetation. Harold knelt, brushing away debris. Stone and concrete emerged, the footprint of what had been a modest home. Mara searched the perimeter while he examined the foundation. She called out after a few minutes, "Harold, look at this." He found her crouched near what must have been the house's rear corner. She'd unearthed a rusted metal box about the size of a shoebox. Together they pried it open. Inside, wrapped in deteriorating plastic, was a photograph. The image showed a family of 4 standing in front of a house, presumably this one, before abandonment claimed it. Frank Whitmore was tall and lean, one hand on his wife's shoulder. Pearl stood beside him, smiling, though there was something tentative in her expression. The 2 children, a boy and a girl, grinned at the camera with gap-toothed joy. Behind them, barely visible in the background, stood 2 horses. Harold stared at the photograph, his throat tight. They looked so happy, so unaware of what was coming. Just like his own family photos from years ago. Emily and Grant young and laughing, believing the future held only promise. "I can't do this," he said abruptly, standing. The photograph fell from his hands. Mara picked it up carefully, studying his face. "We can go back. They lost everything here. Both children." Their whole life destroyed. Harold's voice cracked. What was I thinking, coming to a place like this? You didn't know, Mara said quietly. You were looking for somewhere quiet, somewhere away from your own memories. And I found someone else's tragedy instead. Harold turned away, hands clenched. This place is cursed. It takes children and destroys families. No, Mara said firmly. This place holds sadness, yes. But it's not cursed. The Whitmore's grief doesn't make the land evil. It makes it... She paused, searching for words. It makes it a place that understands loss. Harold shook his head, but something in her words caught him. He thought of the horses, how they'd appeared that first morning, how they kept returning. Pearl and Compass. Mara had named them after the people who'd first loved this land. The horses came back, Mara continued. After their families scattered, after they lost everything familiar, these two found their way here, to this water, this ground. They didn't see it as cursed. They saw it as sanctuary. Harold looked at her. This woman who'd lost her own husband, who spent her days documenting survival in the wild. You really believe that? I believe that grief changes us, but it doesn't have to destroy us. I believe that places can hold multiple stories, tragedy and healing both. She held out the photograph. The Whitmores lost their children here, but they also loved here, built here, lived here. That matters too. Slowly Harold took the photograph back. He studied the faces, Frank's quiet pride, Pearl's gentle smile, the children's pure joy. They'd been real people with real love, and for a time they'd been happy in this place. I haven't been able to go into my children's rooms, Harold admitted. I haven't sorted their belongings or dealt with their estates. I've just left everything frozen, like a museum to their lives. There's no timeline for grief, Mara said. You do what you can, when you can. When did you go into your husband's workshop? 2 years after he died, and I still keep some of his tools exactly where he left them. She smiled sadly. We carry them with us, Harold. The people we've lost. Not as burdens, but as proof that they were real, that the love was real. They walked back to the camp slowly, the photograph tucked safely in Harold's pocket. When they arrived, the horses were waiting by the pond, and Harold felt something shift in his chest again. Not the crack that had formed when they first appeared, but a widening, a small space opening up. Will you help me? He asked Mara. To learn more about this place, about the Whitmores. I think I need to understand what happened here. Of course, Mara said. We'll figure it out together. After she left, Harold sat by the water as evening came on. He pulled out the photograph and looked at it again in the fading light. Then he did something he hadn't been able to do since the funeral. He spoke to his children. Emily, Grant, he said quietly. I'm sorry I ran away. I'm sorry I couldn't face your rooms, your things, the evidence that you're gone. But I think I'm starting to understand something. Maybe this place found me for a reason. The horses grazed nearby, peaceful and present. Harold watched them until full darkness fell, and for the first time in 6 months, the silence didn't feel like drowning. Harold spent the next morning cleaning the small wooden horse he'd discovered near the foundation ruins the day before. It had been buried in mud, its details obscured, but as he worked carefully with a soft brush and water, the craftsmanship revealed itself. Someone, presumably Frank Whitmore, had carved this with patient hands and genuine skill. The horse stood mid-stride, head alert, mane flowing. It fit perfectly in Harold's palm. He placed it on the small shelf inside his camper, next to the photograph. These artifacts felt important, like anchors connecting him to the land's history. That evening, Mara picked him up for dinner in town. Harold had resisted at first. The idea of entering a restaurant, being around people, making conversation felt exhausting, but Mara had been gently insistent. "You need more than camp food," she'd said, "and I promise, the Riverside Tavern is low-key. Nobody will make a fuss." She was right. The restaurant occupied a converted riverside warehouse, its interior warm with old wood and soft lighting. Only a handful of tables were occupied on this Tuesday evening. An elderly man behind the bar looked up as they entered, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Mara Delane," he called out. "Haven't seen you in weeks. Been out chasing your horses again?" "Always, Irving," Mara replied, steering Harold toward a corner booth. "This is Harold Fiske. He's the one who finally bought the old Whitmore property." Irving's eyebrows rose as he approached their table, moving with the careful gait of someone whose joints had logged too many years. He must have been in his 80s, Harold guessed, but his eyes were sharp and curious. "The Whitmore place," Irving repeated, settling into a chair at their table without invitation. "Now that's a name I haven't heard spoken aloud in quite some time. You know about what happened there?" "Some of it," Harold said. "The children who drowned." Irving nodded slowly. "Frank and Pearl. Good people. He was a carpenter, best in 3 counties. Built half the houses in Merrick's Bend, including this building. She taught piano, had students from all over. Their kids were bright as morning, happy as could be. Then came that spring of '74, worst flooding we'd had in decades. The pond overflowed its banks, and those children—" He stopped, shaking his head. "Terrible thing. Destroyed that family completely." "Why didn't anyone buy the property after they left?" Harold asked. Irving leaned back, considering. "Fear, mostly. Superstition. People said the land was cursed, that grief had poisoned the ground. More practically, it flooded bad and wasn't good for much. Plus, the legal situation got messy after Pearl's brother tried subdividing it." Nobody wanted the headache. He studied Harold with those sharp eyes. "What made you take it on?" Harold found himself speaking honestly. "I wasn't thinking about taking anything on. I just needed somewhere to go." Understanding passed across Irving's face. "Mara mentioned you'd had a loss. I'm sorry for that. This world can be cruel in its timing." They ordered food, simple fare, pot roast and vegetables, and Irving returned to the bar. As they ate, Harold felt himself relaxing slightly. The restaurant's warmth, the good food, Mara's easy presence beside him. It was the first time in months he'd felt almost normal. "Tell me about your children," Mara said gently. "If you want to." Harold set down his fork, surprised to find that he did want to. Emily was 31. She'd wanted to be a veterinarian since she was 8 years old, but life got in the way. Money, timing, her mother's and my divorce. She settled for becoming a vet assistant, but she loved it. Every animal she met became her personal mission. He smiled at the memory. She'd call me about injured birds she'd found, stray cats, once a possum that had been hit by a car. She couldn't bear to see anything suffer. "She sounds wonderful," Mara said. She was. And Grant was 28, a civil engineer. He designed bridges, can you imagine? He'd take me to see them once they were built, explain every calculation, every decision. He was so proud of his work, and I was proud of him. Harold's voice thickened. They were close, those two, even with the age difference. They looked out for each other. How did it happen? January 19th, a Tuesday evening. Emily had gone to visit Grant in the city. He'd just gotten engaged, wanted to celebrate. They were driving back together when a drunk driver crossed the median. Harold stared at his plate. "The police said it was instantaneous. They didn't suffer. People say that like it helps, but it doesn't. They were here, and then they weren't. And I didn't get to say goodbye." Mara reached across the table, placing her hand over his. The gesture was simple, but it grounded him. "My husband was Lawrence," she said, "a high school biology teacher. We had 2 years from diagnosis to death. Lung cancer. Never smoked a day in his life. Those 2 years were hell, watching him diminish, lose himself, piece by piece. But at least we had time. Time to say everything that needed saying. Time to prepare as much as anyone can prepare." She paused. "I used to think our way was harder. Now I realize there's no hierarchy to grief. Loss is loss. Do you still miss him?" "Every day, but differently now. At first it was this sharp, constant pain. Now it's more like background music, always there, but I can function around it. I can laugh again. I can work. I can sit in a restaurant with a new friend and not feel like I'm betraying him." "I don't know if I'll get there," Harold admitted. "You will. Not because you forget, but because you learn to carry them differently." After dinner, they walked slowly back to Mara's truck. The town square was quiet, illuminated by old-fashioned street lamps that cast pools of yellow light on the sidewalk. Harold noticed details he'd missed driving through earlier. The war memorial with names dating back to 1917, the community bulletin board covered with flyers for church suppers and lost cats, the pharmacy with its vintage sign. "It's a good town," Mara said, following his gaze. "Small, but the people care about each other. They'll care about you too, once they get to know you. I'm not sure I'm ready for that." "You don't have to be ready. You just have to show up." At the truck, Mara turned to him. "I have a conference next week. 3 days in the capital presenting research findings. I won't be able to visit the land. Will you be all right?" "I think so," Harold said, and was surprised to realize he meant it. A week ago, the thought of being alone would have felt like drowning. Now it felt manageable. "Call if you need anything. I mean that." She squeezed his arm gently before climbing into the truck. Harold watched her taillights disappear down the road, then stood for a moment in the quiet darkness. The town felt peaceful around him, solid and real. He thought about what Irving had said, that Frank Whitmore had built half these buildings, that his craftsmanship was still standing decades later. Back at his camp, Harold built a small fire and sat watching the flames. The horses appeared out of the darkness, their shapes barely visible beyond the firelight. They'd come to accept his evening presence, no longer startled by the fire or his movements. Harold reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something he'd been carrying since the day after the funeral, Emily's silver bracelet. It had been in his truck's glove box, forgotten until a few days ago. The inscription caught the firelight. "Brave heart." He'd given it to her when she was 16, after she'd completed her first solo horseback trail ride. She'd been terrified, but determined, and when she'd finished, she'd been glowing with pride. Harold fastened the bracelet around his own wrist. It was too small, barely fitting, but he managed. The metal was warm from his pocket, and wearing it felt like carrying a piece of her with him. "I'm trying, Emmy," he whispered to the darkness. "I'm trying to find my way through this." The fire crackled, the horses grazed peacefully, and Harold sat there until the flames died to embers, feeling more present in his own life than he had in months. When he finally climbed into the camper to sleep, he fell into a deep, dreamless rest. And when he woke before dawn, he found tears on his face, not the crushing, suffocating grief of before, but something gentler. something that felt almost like healing. The week Mara was away, Harold established new rhythms. He woke with the sun, greeted the horses. He'd started calling them Pearl and Compass aloud now, and spent his mornings working on the land. The physical labor felt necessary, almost meditative. Each fence post he repaired, each path he cleared, felt like an act of reconstruction, not just of the property, but of himself. He named the mare Pearl after Mrs. Whitmore, and the stallion Compass after the brass instrument he'd found. They responded to his voice now, approaching within 20 feet when he called softly. Pearl had an old scar on her left flank, a jagged line that looked like it came from barbed wire years ago. Compass's limp was more pronounced some days than others, probably arthritis in an old injury. Harold found himself researching wild horse care on his phone during the evenings, learning about their nutritional needs, common health issues, seasonal behaviors. He ordered mineral supplements from a feed store in the next county over and left them near the water's edge. The horses investigated cautiously at first, then accepted them. One afternoon, sitting on his camp chair with a notebook, Harold began sketching rough plans for improvements: better water access for dry seasons, a 3-sided shelter for harsh weather, reinforced fencing to protect against predators. He wasn't an engineer like Grant had been, but he understood basic construction. The plans took shape slowly, carefully. His phone rang. Diane's number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Harold, his ex-wife's voice came through, professional and distant as always. I wanted to let you know I'm moving to Arizona. My sister's there, and I need a fresh start. When? End of the month. I've sold the house already. A pause. I wanted to ask if you needed anything from it before I finish clearing it out. Your things are mostly packed, but there are still some photos. Some of the kids' belongings. Harold's chest tightened. I can't. I'm not ready to deal with that. It's been 6 months, Harold. I know how long it's been. His voice came out sharper than intended. Where are you even staying? No one's seen you. Your neighbor says you just disappeared. I bought some land. Up north, I'm figuring things out. Diane's sigh was audible. You're hiding in the middle of nowhere. That's not figuring things out. That's running away. Maybe I needed to run, Harold said quietly. Maybe that's the only way I could survive this. A long silence. Then Diane's voice, softer. I'm not trying to judge you. I just worry. This isn't like you. The old me died with them, Harold said. I'm trying to figure out who's left. After they hung up, Harold sat staring at the phone. Diane was moving on, literally and figuratively. She'd always been better at forward motion, at making decisions and following through. He'd always been the one who needed time to process, to understand before acting. But maybe she was wrong. Maybe he wasn't hiding. Maybe he was finding something. He went to his truck and dug through the glove box until he found it. Emily's silver bracelet with its engraved words. Brave heart. He'd forgotten it was there, tucked away after cleaning out her apartment. The metal was cool against his palm, delicate but strong. Harold fastened it around his wrist. It barely fit, tight against his skin, but he managed. Wearing it felt like carrying her courage with him, a reminder that she'd faced her fears and come through stronger. That evening, he pulled out a fresh notebook and did something he hadn't been able to do since the funeral. He began writing letters to Emily and Grant. Unsent, impossible letters, but necessary ones. Dear Emmy and Grant, he wrote. I'm living on 5 acres of swamp land I bought for $5. I know how crazy that sounds. There are 2 wild horses here. a mare and a stallion. I've named them Pearl and Compass. They come every morning, and I think they're teaching me something about survival, about keeping going even when everything familiar is gone. The words flowed easier than he expected. He told them about Mara, about the Whitmore family's tragedy, about the way the land seemed to hold both sorrow and possibility. He told them about his fears, his regrets, the moments when the grief still knocked him sideways. "I'm learning that grief doesn't mean forgetting you," he wrote. "It means carrying you differently, not as weight that drags me down, but as light that shows me the way forward." I hope that makes sense. I hope you'd understand what I'm trying to do here. Over the next few days, Harold noticed the pond's water level dropping. At first, he assumed it was seasonal variation, but research told him it should be higher this time of year. He walked the perimeter, examining the inlet stream, and discovered the problem. A culvert upstream was blocked with decades of debris, choking the water flow. The project was too big for one person. Harold stared at the tangled mass of fallen branches, old tires, rusted metal, and accumulated sediment. He'd need help, equipment, probably county approval. He called the local office, but they were sympathetic and useless in equal measure. "We're short-staffed, Mr. Fiske. It'll be months before we can get out there. You're welcome to clear it yourself if you follow regulations." Harold hung up, frustrated, but not defeated. He'd figure something out. The next morning, a teenager appeared at the edge of his camp. The boy was 17, maybe 18, lanky and watchful, with the kind of wariness that spoke of trouble in his past. "Mr. Irving sent me," the kid said. "Said you might have work. I need community service hours." Harold studied him. "What's your name?" "Corey. Corey Brennan." He shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "I messed up. Got caught spray painting the overpass. Judge said 100 hours of community service or juvie. And you chose this? Irving said you were decent. Said the work would be real, not just busy work." Corey met Harold's eyes. "I'm good with my hands. I can work hard. I just need a chance." Harold recognized something in the boy, that mixture of defiance and hope, anger and vulnerability. He'd seen it in students over the years, kids who needed guidance more than punishment. "Can you start now?" Harold asked. Relief washed across Corey's face. "Yes, sir." They worked together, clearing brush that first day, establishing a rhythm. Corey didn't talk much, but he watched everything, the land, the horses when they appeared, Harold's methodical approach to each task. When Pearl and Compass came to drink, the boy froze, wonder breaking through his guarded expression. "They're wild," Corey whispered. "Completely. But they've learned to trust this place." At lunch, sitting on logs near the camper, Corey opened up slightly. His father had left 2 years ago. His mother worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat. He'd gotten angry, made bad choices, ended up in trouble. "I don't know what I'm doing with my life," Corey admitted. "Everyone says I'm wasting my potential, but I don't even know what that means." Harold thought about his decades of teaching, all the students who'd sat in his classroom searching for direction. Potential isn't something you waste, it's something you discover, usually by trying things, failing, trying again. "You sound like a teacher." "I was, for 30 years. "History." "You retired?" "I did." "Then I lost." Harold stopped, the words catching. "Then some things happened, and I needed to start over. So here I am, learning to rebuild." Corey looked around at the swamp, the water, the grazing horses. Doesn't seem like a bad place to start. By the end of the day, Harold made a decision. "If you want steady work for the summer, beyond your required hours, I'll pay you. There's a lot that needs doing here." "Yeah?" Hope flickered in Corey's eyes. You mean it? I do. But you show up on time, work hard, and treat this land with respect. Deal? Deal, Corey said, shaking Harold's hand with unexpected formality. After the boy left, Harold sat by the water as evening came on. The horses grazed nearby, and somewhere in the distance, a great blue heron called out. Harold touched Emily's bracelet on his wrist and felt something shift in his chest. Not the heavy grief of loss, but something lighter. Purpose, maybe. Or hope. Mara returned from her conference on a bright Thursday morning, pulling up to find Harold and Corey knee-deep in the blocked culvert, covered in mud and debris. She stood watching for a moment, hands on her hips, before calling out, I leave for 3 days and you start a major engineering project. Harold straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead and leaving a streak of mud. The pond was dropping. We're fixing the water flow. We're trying to fix it, Corey corrected, grinning. Mostly we're just getting dirty. Mara changed into work clothes and joined them, bringing a systematic approach that the project desperately needed. She identified which debris could be removed safely, which required cutting, and how to redirect the flow without causing erosion downstream. Within hours, the 3 of them had established an efficient rhythm. How was the conference? Harold asked during a water break. Productive. I presented findings on wild horse population decline in the region. Mara's expression grew serious. It's worse than I thought. Habitat loss is accelerating. There are maybe 30 horses left in the wild across 3 counties. Pearl and Compass are part of the last stable pair in this area. What happens if they lose access to water sources like this? Corey asked. They die or get captured and relocated. Sometimes relocated horses don't adapt to new territory. The stress kills them. Mara looked toward the pond where the horses grazed. This land could be registered as a conservation site. It would offer legal protection, possibly grant funding for improvements. Harold considered this. I bought it to disappear. Now you're talking about making it official, permanent. I'm talking about protecting something important, Mara said gently. But it's your land, Harold. Your decision. They worked until evening, finally clearing enough debris that water began flowing freely again. The sound of it rushing through the culvert was deeply satisfying. Corey whooped with triumph, and even Harold smiled. Over the following weeks, a new project took shape. They'd discovered an old, collapsed shed near the property's eastern edge, and inside it, a cache of woodworking tools, saws, planes, chisels, all rusted but salvageable. Corey became fascinated with the restoration process, and Harold found himself teaching the boy to clean and maintain the tools properly. These belonged to Frank Whitmore, Harold explained, working oil into a handsaw's blade. He built half the town with tools like these. They're worth saving. What are we going to use them for? Corey asked. I want to build a shelter for the horses. 3-sided, open to the south, big enough for them to get out of harsh weather. You think they'll use it? Maybe. Maybe not. But we'll build it anyway. Mara watched this mentorship bloom with quiet approval. She and Harold had fallen into an easy partnership. She'd arrive most mornings with coffee. They'd work together on various projects, share lunch, talk about everything and nothing. The conversations ranged from wild horse ecology to their childhoods to the small details of daily life. One afternoon, working side by side to measure lumber for the shelter, their hands brushed. Neither pulled away immediately. The moment stretched, charged with possibility, until Mara cleared her throat and stepped back. Sorry, she said. Don't be, Harold replied quietly. They didn't discuss it, but something had shifted between them. Harold found himself noticing details, the way sunlight caught in her grey hair, her competent hands as she worked, her laugh when Corey said something unexpectedly funny. It felt like betrayal at first, this awareness of another person, this flicker of attraction. But gradually, he recognized it as something else. Evidence that he was still alive, still capable of connection. The shelter construction took weeks. Harold taught Corey basic carpentry, how to measure twice and cut once, how to read wood grain, how to join pieces so they'd hold against wind and weather. They worked with Frank Whitmore's restored tools, and there was something deeply satisfying about using implements that had built so much before to build something new. "My dad used to say he'd teach me stuff like this," Corey said one day, concentrating on a difficult cut. "Before he left, I mean. He was always going to teach me things. He just never got around to it." "His loss," Harold said. "You're a natural at this." Corey ducked his head, but Harold saw the pleased flush on his face. As they worked, Corey opened up more. He talked about his fears, that he'd end up like his father, that he'd never amount to anything, that he'd let his mother down after everything she'd sacrificed. Harold listened, offering no easy answers but genuine attention. "You want to know what I've learned?" Harold said during one of these conversations. "Mistakes don't have to be the end of your story. They can be the beginning of a better one. You made a bad choice, got caught, and now you're here learning something valuable. That's not failure. That's course correction." "You ever make mistakes?" Corey asked. Harold thought about the years he'd prioritized work over family dinners, the times he'd been too tired or busy to really listen to Emily and Grant, the small moments of connection he'd let slip away. "More than I can count. I put my career ahead of my kids sometimes. Missed important moments because I was grading papers or preparing lessons. I told myself I was providing for them, but really I was just avoiding being present. Do you regret it? Every day. But regret can teach you or destroy you. I'm trying to let it teach me." The shelter took final shape, a solid structure with a pitched roof to shed rain, open on one side for easy access, positioned to block prevailing winds. When they finished, they stepped back to admire their work. Even Mara, arriving with late afternoon coffee, was impressed. "That's professional-grade construction," she said. "Frank Whitmore would be proud." That evening, a sudden storm rolled in, dark clouds and driving rain. They retreated to Harold's camper, the three of them crowded around the small table, playing cards while thunder rumbled overhead. Through the window they watched the horses investigating the new shelter. Pearl entered first, cautious but curious. Compass followed. They stood inside, protected from the rain, and Harold felt a surge of satisfaction so pure it brought tears to his eyes. "They're using it," Corey breathed. "They actually trust it." "They trust us," Mara corrected, her hand finding Harold's under the table. After the storm passed and Corey had left for home, Mara stayed. They sat outside, watching the stars emerge between breaking clouds. The horses remained in the shelter, visible as darker shapes against darkness. "I need to tell you something," Mara said. "I'm falling for you. I know it's complicated, and I know we're both carrying grief. But I wanted you to know." Harold turned to look at her, this woman who'd appeared in his life, like the horses, unexpected, gentle, persistent. "I'm falling for you too. It scares me." "Me too," she admitted. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe being scared means we're healing enough to risk something again." They sat close together, not quite touching but not apart either, and watched the night deepen around them. Inside Harold's chest, something that had been frozen for months continued its slow thaw. Not forgetting, but transforming. Not replacing what was lost, but making space for what could still be found. When Mara finally left, she paused at her truck. I'm glad you bought this land, Harold. I think it was waiting for you. Harold watched her tail lights disappear, then turned back to survey his small kingdom, the pond reflecting starlight, the horses safe in their shelter, the paths he'd cleared and the fences he'd repaired. He'd come here to hide from life. Instead, he'd stumbled into building a new one. Harold was working on the pond's eastern edge with Mara and Corey when the silver sedan appeared, navigating the rutted access road with obvious difficulty. A man emerged, mid-50s, wearing a business suit that looked absurd in the swamp setting, carrying a leather portfolio. "Mr. Fiske?" he called out, picking his way carefully through the mud. Harold straightened, wiping his hands. "That's me. Lloyd Hutchins. I represent Lakeshore Properties." He extended a hand that Harold shook reluctantly. "Beautiful piece of land you have here. Mind if we talk business?" "I'm not interested in selling." Lloyd smiled, unperturbed. "You haven't heard my offer yet. $50,000 for your 5 acres. That's 10,000 times what you paid." "The answer's still no." Lloyd's smile tightened. "Mr. Fiske, we're assembling parcels for a significant resort development. Premium lakefront cabins, a marina, recreational facilities. Your property provides crucial water access. We're prepared to be very generous." "This isn't lakefront, it's wetland, and these horses need access to this water." "Horses can be relocated. The county has programs." Lloyd pulled papers from his portfolio. "I have the purchase agreement right here. You could sign today, have the money in your account by Friday." "I said no." Harold's voice hardened. "I'd like you to leave my property." Lloyd's pleasant demeanor cracked slightly. "Mr. Fiske, I'm trying to do this the easy way, but there are complications with your title that could make things difficult. It would be much simpler if we could come to an agreement." "What complications?" "I think you should consult with a lawyer. These old subdivided properties can be legally complex." Lloyd tucked the papers away. "Think about my offer. I'll be in touch." After he left, unease settled over the group. Mara broke the silence first. "We need to verify your title. Make sure everything's legally sound." They drove to the county records office that afternoon, leaving Corey to watch the land. Mrs. Pruitt, the clerk, remembered Mara from their previous visit and pulled the relevant documents. "The Whitmore property," she mused, spreading maps across the counter. Always knew someone would ask about this eventually. What they discovered changed everything. The original 1974 survey showed Frank and Pearl Whitmore owning 40 acres, not 5. After the tragedy, Pearl's brother had subdivided the property without proper legal authority. The subdivisions had been sold piecemeal over decades, but the titles were questionable at best. "Your $5 purchase was for the original tract," Mrs. Pruitt explained. "That language in the auction description might give you claim to all 40 acres. Harold stared at the map. 40 acres. 8 times what he thought he owned. "Most of these parcels reverted to wilderness after sale," Mrs. Pruitt continued. "Nobody developed them. If you pursued this legally, you could potentially own the entire original Whitmore property." Mara's eyes widened. "That would make conservation status even more impactful. We could protect significant wetland habitat." "I didn't buy the land for this," Harold said. "I just wanted somewhere quiet." "But Lakeshore Properties knows," Mrs. Pruitt said gravely. "That's why they're pressuring you. They've been quietly buying surrounding land for 2 years. They're waiting for someone to claim the Whitmore property so they can make an offer. Or challenge the claim," Mara added. "If Harold doesn't secure the full property, they'll try to take it." Back at the land, they found Corey agitated. "That guy came back while you were gone. Lloyd. He walked all over, taking photos. said something about squatters' rights and proper surveys. Then Compass spooked and hurt his leg worse. Harold found the stallion favouring his injured leg heavily, Pearl staying close and protective. His heart clenched. These animals had become his responsibility, and now they were caught in the middle of something he'd never anticipated. Mara examined Compass carefully. He'll be okay, but he needs rest. The stress isn't good for him. That evening, Harold sat with the legal documents spread across his camper table. 40 acres, the horses, the history, everything he'd begun to build here, all of it suddenly at risk. If he didn't fight for the land, developers would destroy it. But fighting meant lawyers, money he didn't have, time and energy he wasn't sure he possessed. Mara arrived as darkness fell, finding him still sitting in the lamplight, staring at papers. "I can help with legal costs," she offered. "I have savings. This land matters. I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking. I'm offering." She sat beside him. "Harold, when you first bought this place, what were you looking for?" "An ending," he admitted. "A place to disappear. And now I have something worth protecting. These horses, this history, what we're building." He looked at her. "You. Corey. A purpose I didn't know I needed. Then we fight for it." Over the next week, Harold consulted with Constance Fairchild, an attorney from the county seat who took the case after hearing the full story. They searched archives, hunting for Pearl Whitmore's original will, the key document that could solidify Harold's claim. Meanwhile, Lakeshore sent survey crews onto the land. Harold confronted them, demanding they leave, but they claimed right of access for potential future development. The sheriff was called and advised Harold to pursue legal clarity quickly. The situation divided Merrick's Bend. Some residents saw jobs and tax revenue from development. Others remembered the Whitmores, valued the ecological importance of the wetland. A town meeting was called, forcing Harold into the uncomfortable position of defending his claim publicly. The breakthrough came when Constance discovered Pearl Whitmore's will in a mislabeled archive box at the Historical Society. Harold stood in the dusty room as she read it aloud. "The land should remain undivided and wild, a place where creatures find sanctuary." Pearl had never authorized the subdivision. Her brother had acted against her explicit wishes after her death. The will was clear, properly executed, and legally binding. "This solidifies your claim," Constance said. "Your $5 purchase of the original tract gives you right to all 40 acres. But Lakeshore Properties wasn't finished. They filed a counterclaim, citing the multiple sales over decades as establishing precedent. The legal battle would take months, but Harold could file for an injunction against development. The night before the town meeting, Harold sat with Mara by a small fire. The horses grazed nearby, peaceful despite the turmoil swirling around them. "I'm terrified of losing this," Harold admitted. "I've lost so much already. My children, my marriage, myself for a while. I can't lose this too." Mara took his hand. "Then we won't let you. But Harold, you need to understand something. You've already won what matters most." "What do you mean?" "You found your way back. You're fighting for something beyond yourself. That's not a nothing. That's everything." She leaned her forehead against his, and they sat like that in the firelight, not quite kissing, but making a promise, nonetheless. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. Morning arrived too quickly. Harold dressed in his best clothes, nervous but resolute. Corey appeared early, bringing his mother Shelley, who'd taken the morning off work to support them. "Whatever happens in there," Corey said, "you've already changed my life. I wanted you to know that." The three of them walked into the town hall together, ready to fight for a $5 piece of land that had become worth everything. The town hall was packed. Harold had never seen so many people in one place in Merrick's Bend. Supporters and opponents filled every seat, with more standing along the walls. Lakeshore Properties representatives occupied the front row, Lloyd Hutchins among them, looking confident and professional. Harold took his place at the podium with Mara and Corey flanking him. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged his notes. Constance sat nearby, with the legal documents, ready to present the evidence. Mayor Walsh called the meeting to order. "We're here to discuss Mr. Fiske's request for an injunction against development on the former Whitmore property. Mr. Fiske, you have 15 minutes. Harold cleared his throat, looking out at the sea of faces. Some he recognized from the tavern, from the general store, from his brief interactions in town. Others were strangers, watching with skepticism or curiosity. "I want to tell you about Pearl and Frank Whitmore," he began, his voice steadier than he felt. In 1952, they bought 40 acres of wetland and built a life there. Frank was a carpenter. Many of you are sitting in buildings he constructed. Pearl taught piano to children from across 3 counties. They raised 2 kids and kept horses. By all accounts, they were happy. He paused, letting the weight of what came next settle. Then, in 1974, their children drowned in the pond during a spring flood. Both of them, gone in an instant. The grief destroyed Frank and Pearl. They abandoned the land and never returned. Harold saw heads nodding, remembered pain crossing older faces. I learned this after I bought the property. $5 for 5 acres at a county auction. I wasn't looking for an investment or a project. I was looking for a place to disappear. His voice caught. 6 months ago, I lost both my children in a car accident. Emily was 31. Grant was 28. They were my whole world, and then they were gone. The room was silent now, attention complete. I went to that land because I couldn't face the world anymore. I expected nothing from it except solitude. But on my first morning there, 2 wild horses appeared at the water's edge. They came back every day. Something about them kept me from giving up entirely. Harold described Pearl and Compass, their bond, their survival, despite losing their family herd. He explained their ecological importance, the declining wild horse population, the critical need for protected water access. Then I met Mara Delane, a wildlife biologist who'd been studying these horses for years. She told me about the Whitmores, helped me understand the land's history. And she told me something else. She'd known my daughter Emily. They'd worked together at an animal rescue years ago. He looked at Mara, drawing strength from her presence. That $5 piece of land became more than an escape. It became a place where grief and healing existed side by side, where the past and present connected, where I learned that loss doesn't have to be the end of your story. Harold displayed Pearl Whitmore's will, explaining how her explicit wishes had been violated by the illegal subdivision. Constance presented the legal argument clearly. Harold's purchase gave him rightful claim to the full 40 acres. "This isn't about money," Harold continued. "Lakeshore Properties offered me $50,000. I refused because this land represents something more valuable than any dollar amount. It represents memory, healing, and sanctuary. Not just for me and the horses, but for everyone who needs a place where nature still exists as it should." He outlined the conservation value: wetlands filtering water, providing habitat, preventing flooding. He made the economic argument for ecotourism and educational programs over short-term development gains. "I came here broken," Harold said, his voice carrying to the back of the room. "This land didn't fix me, but it gave me a place to begin fixing myself. I believe it can do the same for others. The Whitmores suffered terrible tragedy here, but Pearl's last wish was that the land remain wild, a sanctuary for creatures. I'm asking you to honor that wish, to protect what remains, rather than destroy it for profit." Lloyd Hutchins rose for rebuttal. His presentation was slick, professional, focused on jobs, tax revenue, economic growth. He questioned the validity of Harold's title, suggested the subdivision precedent held legal weight, painted Harold as a well-meaning but naive outsider, standing in the way of progress. "Mr. Fiske's story is touching," Lloyd concluded, "but sentiment doesn't override property law or economic reality. Merrick's Bend deserves growth and opportunity, not more undeveloped wetland." The debate grew heated. Voices rose on both sides. Harold felt the momentum shifting, uncertainty spreading through the crowd. Then Irving stood. The old man's presence commanded immediate silence. As the town's eldest resident, his word carried weight that transcended any legal argument. "Frank and Pearl Whitmore were my friends," Irving said, his voice strong despite his years. "I watched them build their life on that land. I watched them bury their children and break apart from grief. Pearl came to see me once, years later, before she died. She told me she regretted leaving the land, that she should have honored her children's memory by keeping it wild and beautiful as they'd known it." He turned to face Harold directly. "Pearl believed the land had purpose beyond what she could see. I think Harold's proven her right. He's shown that grief doesn't have to be the end, that places can hold both sorrow and hope. That's worth protecting." Others began standing, first one, then another, then a dozen. The tide shifted visibly as townspeople chose sides through simple acts of solidarity. Harold felt tears burning in his eyes at this unexpected support. The council vote was called. 7 members would decide whether to recommend supporting Harold's injunction to the county. After brief deliberation, the mayor announced the result, 5-2 in Harold's favor. Not a complete victory, the legal battle would continue, but a crucial step forward. Lakeshore representatives left immediately, Lloyd's expression tight with barely controlled anger. The community that remained celebrated quietly but meaningfully. People approached Harold to share their own memories of the Whitmores, their support for conservation, their appreciation for what he was trying to protect. As evening fell, Harold, Mara, and Corey returned to the land. Exhaustion settled over them, but also hope. The horses waited by the pond, grazing peacefully in the last light. "Whatever comes next," Mara said, her hand finding Harold's, "you're not facing it alone." Harold looked at the land he'd bought for $5, the land that had given him back his life. "No," he agreed. "I'm not alone anymore." 3 days after the town meeting, the injunction was granted. Lakeshore Properties was temporarily barred from any development activity on the disputed land. Harold, Mara, and Corey spent those days working the expanded 40-acre boundary, marking fence lines, documenting the terrain, making the claim real through physical presence. The work felt different now, purposeful, urgent, but also joyful. They were building something that would last beyond themselves. Corey talked about college programs in environmental science, his future suddenly visible where before there'd been only fog. Mara's research took on new dimensions, with 40 protected acres to study. And Harold found himself thinking not about endings, but about legacy. The weather forecast warned of storms, a major system moving in from the west, unseasonable in its intensity. They spent an afternoon securing everything that could blow away, reinforcing fence sections, ensuring the horses' shelter was sound. "You should head home before it hits," Harold told Mara as dark clouds gathered on the horizon. "I'm staying," she said simply. "I'm not driving in this, and besides, you might need help." Corey left reluctantly to check on his mother, making Harold promise to call if things got bad. As the boy's truck disappeared down the rutted road, the first fat raindrops began to fall. Harold and Mara retreated to the camper as the storm intensified. Rain drummed on the metal roof. Wind shook the small structure. They sat close together at the table, speaking in low voices about everything and nothing, the intimacy of the moment heightened by the weather's fury outside. "When this is all settled," Mara said, "when the legal battles are done and the land is secure, what do you want this place to become?" Harold considered. "A sanctuary. Not just for horses, but for people who need what I needed. A place to grieve, to heal, to find purpose again." "That's beautiful," Mara said softly. "I couldn't have imagined it 6 months ago. I could barely imagine tomorrow." He took her hand. "You've shown me that life doesn't end with loss. It just changes shape. You did that yourself. I was just here to witness it." The moment hung between them, charged with possibility. Then Mara leaned forward and kissed him. Gentle, tentative, full of middle-aged awareness of both fragility and gift. Harold kissed her back, feeling something long dormant stir in his chest. Not forgetting Emily and Grant, not replacing what he'd lost, but making space for what could still exist. When they pulled apart, Mara touched his face gently. "I've been alone for 4 years. I thought that was my future. Then you bought a swamp for $5 and everything changed." "Best $5 I ever spent," Harold said, making her laugh. The storm intensified rapidly, wind shrieking, lightning splitting the sky, rain falling in sheets. Through the camper window, they saw the horses moving restlessly near their shelter. "Something's wrong," Harold said, pulling on his rain gear. They ventured out into the deluge, flashlights cutting weak paths through the darkness. The pond was rising fast, the repaired culvert overwhelmed by sudden water volume. The shelter stood firm, but water was creeping toward it, flooding the low ground. Pearl and Compass were agitated, Pearl's ears flat against her head, Compass limping more severely than usual. They needed to move to higher ground, the old Whitmore Foundation site, 30 yards upslope. "Can we lead them?" Mara shouted over the storm. "We have to try." It was difficult, dangerous work. Pearl trusted Harold enough to follow his voice and gestures, but Compass was frightened, his injury making movement painful. Harold moved slowly, patiently, speaking constantly in low, soothing tones. Mara positioned herself to guide without crowding, using her body language to direct without forcing. Lightning struck the massive oak tree that marked the property's northern boundary. The sound was deafening, the flash blinding. The tree split vertically, its trunk cleaving open but not falling. In that brilliant flash, Harold saw something, carved deep into the heartwood, revealed by the lightning strike. Initials: FW plus PW, 1952. Frank and Pearl Whitmore, their love literally written into the living wood, preserved for 70 years. Harold stood transfixed despite the rain, seeing in those carved letters a testament to endurance, to love that outlasted tragedy. "Harold," Mara's voice pulled him back. "We need to move." They got both horses to safety on higher ground, near the foundation ruins. Pearl immediately positioned herself protectively near Compass, who stood trembling but secure. Harold and Mara stayed with them, providing human presence as reassurance. As the storm raged, Harold thought about those carved initials. Frank and Pearl had loved here, built here, suffered here. Their children had played in these woods, splashed in that pond. Tragedy had driven the family away, but their mark remained, in the wood, in the land itself, in the memory of people like Irving. Dawn came slowly, the storm finally exhausting itself. Damage assessment revealed fallen branches, significant erosion, sections of fence down. But the shelter stood intact, the horses were safe, and the carved oak, though split, still lived, its roots too deep to surrender. "Look," Mara said, pointing to the property's far edge. The flooding had washed away soil along the boundary line, revealing old stone markers buried for decades. Constance would be pleased. Physical evidence of the original 40-acre tract, more ammunition for the legal case. But Harold was looking at something else. The breach in the fence line, where his property met Lakeshore's adjacent holdings. The collapsed section created legal ambiguity about boundaries. Exactly the kind of complication Lloyd Hutchins would exploit. "We need to document everything," Mara said, already pulling out her phone. "Photos, measurements, witness statements." "They'll use this against us," Harold said quietly. "Then we'll be ready." Mara squeezed his shoulder. "We didn't come this far to give up now." The horses descended carefully from their refuge as water receded. They approached Harold and Mara without fear, Pearl nuzzling Harold's hand with surprising gentleness. Compass stood close, his dark eyes calm now, trusting. "We protected them," Harold said, wonder in his voice. "They're safe because we were here." "You protected them," Mara corrected. "This was your choice, your fight. I'm just grateful to be part of it." Together they stood in the dawn light, muddy and exhausted, but unbowed, while the land slowly revealed what the storm had uncovered and what still needed defending. Lloyd Hutchins arrived with his crew before Harold had finished his morning coffee. The silver sedan navigated the mud-rutted road more carefully this time, followed by a truck carrying survey equipment. "Quite a storm," Lloyd called out, emerging in work boots instead of dress shoes. "Thought we'd check our adjacent property for damage. Hope you don't mind." "I do mind," Harold said. "This is private property. The boundary line is in question now." Lloyd gestured toward the collapsed fence section. "Until that's legally resolved, we have every right to verify our holdings." Harold's jaw tightened, but Mara placed a warning hand on his arm. Lloyd and his crew spent an hour examining the breach, taking photographs, making notes. Their presence agitated the horses, who retreated to the far side of the pond. "This might be a good time to reconsider our offer," Lloyd said before leaving. "Storm damage, legal fees, boundary disputes. These things add up. Before costs mount any further, you might want to cut your losses." "Get off my land," Harold said quietly. After they left, Harold stood staring at the damaged fence line, frustration burning in his chest. Everything they'd built, everything they'd protected, could still be taken away by legal maneuvering and corporate pressure. Corey arrived mid-morning, with his mother Shelley, both carrying tools. Within an hour, more townspeople appeared, Irving directing operations despite his age, families bringing supplies, younger volunteers ready to work. The community response was overwhelming. "You're not doing this alone," Irving said firmly when Harold tried to protest. "This land matters to all of us now." They worked together, rebuilding what the storm had damaged. Constance arrived with proper surveying equipment, documenting the revealed stone markers that confirmed the 40-acre boundary. The breach, she explained, actually strengthened Harold's case. The erosion had exposed original property markers that predated the illegal subdivisions. "Lakeshore knows this," Constance said. "That's why they're desperate. Every day that passes, your claim gets stronger." By afternoon, the major repairs were complete. The community cookout that followed felt like a celebration, though Harold knew the battle wasn't over. He stood before the gathered volunteers, feeling the weight of their support. "I came here wanting nothing from anyone," he said. "You've shown me that isolation isn't healing. Connection is. Thank you for helping protect something that matters." "It's not just about the land," Irving replied. "It's about what you're building here. Purpose, community, hope. Those things are worth fighting for." As sunset approached and people began leaving, Harold, Mara, and Corey sat by the restored pond. The horses grazed peacefully, fully comfortable now with human presence. Pearl's contentment was visible in her relaxed posture. Compasses in the way he dozed standing, one hip cocked. "I've been thinking," Harold said. "When this is settled, I want to make this official. The Whitmore Fiske Wildlife Sanctuary. Educational programs, conservation research, a place for the community. And grief counseling," Mara added. "People processing loss could come here, work with the land and animals, find what you found." "I want to help run it," Corey said. "After I finish school, I mean. If you'd have me." Harold looked at this boy who'd arrived, angry and lost, now talking about his future with confidence. "I'd be honored." They discussed plans late into the evening, visitor trails, observation platforms, partnerships with schools, research programs. What had started as Harold's escape was transforming into something far larger than himself. Harold retrieved something from his camper, his old teaching award plaque, brought from home weeks ago. He'd been the district's Teacher of the Year 3 times, recognition for decades of guiding students through history's complexities. "Help me mount this," he said, carrying it to the main fence post. They secured the plaque carefully. Excellence in Education, Harold Fiske. It gleamed in the fading light, a bridge between his past and present. "You're still teaching," Mara observed, "just in a different classroom." "I'm learning as much as teaching," Harold replied. "Maybe more." As darkness gathered, Corey left for home. But Mara stayed. They sat on Harold's small porch, hands intertwined, watching stars emerge. "I talked to Diane yesterday," Harold said. "My ex-wife. She's settled in Arizona, starting over. She said she's proud of what I'm doing here. That Emily and Grant would be proud too." "They would be," Mara agreed. "You've taken your grief and transformed it into something beautiful. I couldn't have done it alone. None of us can. That's the point." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "When Lawrence died, I thought my capacity for love died with him. You've shown me that's not true. The heart doesn't have a limit. It just expands to hold more." Harold thought about Emily's bracelet on his wrist, about Grant's engineering mind that would have loved solving the culvert problem, about how their absence was still painful, but no longer paralyzing. "I came here to grieve," he said quietly. "I found a reason to live instead." Pearl whinnied softly from the darkness, answered by Compass's lower call. The sound carried across the water, a conversation between survivors who'd found their sanctuary. "Tomorrow Lloyd will probably file new motions," Mara said practically. "The legal battle continues." "Let it continue," Harold replied. "I'm not going anywhere. This is home now." They sat in comfortable silence as the night deepened. Two people who'd been broken by loss, now mending together in a place that understood both sorrow and hope. The $5 piece of land had become priceless, not in monetary value, but in what it represented. The possibility of beginning again when you thought all beginnings were behind you. 6 months later, early spring returned to the land. Harold stood at the entrance to what was now officially the Whitmore Fiske Wildlife Sanctuary, watching workers install the bronze plaque he'd commissioned. The inscription read, "Where grief becomes grace," followed by the names of Emily and Grant Fiske, Frank and Pearl Whitmore, and the horses Pearl and Compass, honored in perpetuity. The legal battle had ended 3 weeks earlier. Lakeshore Properties withdrew their claim after the county ruled decisively in Harold's favor. The 40 acres were protected under conservation easement, guaranteed wild forever. Harold had won, though the victory felt less like triumph and more like relief. The relief of knowing what he'd built couldn't be destroyed. The sanctuary had transformed over winter. Trails wound through the property with educational signage explaining wetland ecology. Observation platforms provided viewing areas that didn't disturb wildlife. A small cabin stood beside Harold's now permanent residence, Mara's research station. Though she spent most nights in his home, their separate spaces a courtesy more than necessity. Corey had graduated high school with honors and enrolled in the State University's Environmental Science program. He worked part-time at the sanctuary, leading tours and maintaining the grounds with the same dedication he'd shown from the beginning. But the most remarkable change was the horses. Pearl had foaled unexpectedly in late winter, a bay filly they'd named Hope. The birth had been straightforward, natural, Mara documenting every stage for her research. Now Hope bounded through the marsh grass on long, awkward legs, while Pearl grazed and Compass stood watch, their small family complete. Today was the grand opening. The community gathered, joined by local officials, press, and descendants of the Whitmore family, whom Constance had located. Pearl Whitmore's great-niece, a woman in her 70s named Agnes, had traveled from Oregon for the ceremony. Harold greeted her warmly. "Thank you for coming. Your great-aunt's wish is finally being honored." Agnes's eyes were wet. "I barely remember her, but family stories said she never recovered from losing her children. To know the land is protected, that it's helping others heal, she would have loved that." She presented Harold with an unexpected gift, Pearl Whitmore's piano bench, the only possession remaining from her great-aunt's life. Inside, they discovered letters Pearl had written but never sent to Frank after the tragedy. Harold read one aloud to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying across the still morning. "May this place that held our sorrow one day hold another's joy. May the land that took from us give to others. May grief find transformation here, and may creatures wild and free know sanctuary in this ground we loved." The words hung in the air, profound in their prescience. Pearl had somehow known, had hoped, that healing would return to this place. "She wrote this 50 years ago," Harold said, looking at the faces before him. "I didn't know it existed when I bought this land for $5. But somehow, I fulfilled her prayer. We all have. This sanctuary exists because grief brought me here, but also because community, connection, and purpose kept me." Pearl Whitmore understood that places hold memory. She also understood they can hold hope. The ceremony continued with remarks from officials, presentations from Mara about the sanctuary's conservation importance, and a ribbon cutting that felt both ceremonial and genuine. When it finished, Harold led the first official tour, a group of local school children, their faces bright with curiosity. He guided them through the marsh, teaching about wetland ecology, wild horses, the interconnected web of life that depended on places like this. The children's questions were eager, their wonder at seeing Pearl, Compass, and Hope undiluted by adult cynicism. One boy, perhaps 10 years old, asked, "Why did you buy this land?" Harold smiled, remembering a similar question from Corey months ago. "I didn't know when I bought it, but sometimes the best things find us when we're not looking. Sometimes what saves us appears in unexpected places." After the tour, after the visitors had departed and quiet returned, Harold found himself alone by the pond. Diane had visited briefly, healthy and settled in her new life. Their conversation had been awkward, but genuine, both of them acknowledging they'd survived the unsurvivable differently. Both paths valid. "She touched this," Diane had said, indicating Emily's bracelet on Harold's wrist. "She loved that you gave it to her. She wore it constantly." "I wear it now," Harold replied, "to remember her courage. She'd be so proud of you. They both would be." Now, as evening approached, Mara joined him by the water. The horses grazed nearby, Hope nursing briefly before returning to her explorations. "Thinking about them?" Mara asked. "Always, but differently now." Harold pulled out his journal, the one where he'd written countless letters to Emily and Grant. "I wrote to them this morning, told them about the sanctuary, about you, about Corey and how he's thriving, about how their absence still hurts, but how I've learned to build a life around that hurt instead of being consumed by it." "What did you tell them?" Harold read from the page. "You're here in every bit of this. Your love of animals, Emmy. Your building skills, Grant. Your belief that I could be more than I thought I was. This sanctuary exists because you existed. Because your love shaped me into someone who could do this work." He closed the journal, looking at the land he'd bought for $5, the land that had given him back his life. "I thought $5 bought me land. It bought me a future, not the one I planned, but the one I needed. Grief hollowed me out," he continued softly. "But in that hollow space, something new could grow. The land didn't heal me. It gave me a place to heal myself, and that's made all the difference." Mara took his hand as sunset painted the water gold. Hope played in the shallows while her parents watched, 3 generations of survival and renewal. The sanctuary settled into evening peace, holding both memory and promise, exactly as Pearl Whitmore had hoped it would.